Stop killing video games. A salacious, combative sounding statement that, if you are a lifelong fan of the gaming entertainment medium, is sure to grab your attention. When we read sentences like this on the internet, it's easy to instantly assume that such a call to action is hyperbolic nonsense relating to hot topics such as identity politics, half-baked modern game releases, or the ever-increasing expectation and reliance that publishers are placing on consumers, making microtransactions to ensure their company's economic growth continues. This is ridiculous, as most of us currently live in an environment at present where most people are trying to keep their heads above water. So rather than taking measures to sustain what they have in these tough times like most of us do, these rich CEOs are continuing to aggressively attempt to attain quick growth at consumers' expenses just to appease shareholders, but to the detriment of the company's long-term reputation and potentially profits over decades. This greed and obsession over profits above sustainability through the toughest of times is a driving factor in why thousands of development staff members are currently being laid off in the industry.
You're fired, Keenan.
And contributing towards the continual spiral of doom, lowering the quality of games and increasing prices at the customer's behest. Actions which many believe will lead towards an inevitable video game crash. In this day and age, it seems that board members and CEOs are more desperate to short-sightedly kill the game industry than ever before through their own greed. Greed is a running theme in the world of AAA corporate gaming at present, and while we can't do much to prevent many of these things beyond voting with our pockets, it seems there is indeed a chance of stopping them from killing video games, at least in a more literal sense. So, what do we mean by this? For years and years now, the people in charge of giant video game publishers have literally been destroying our games before our very eyes. As usual, in a race for profit above consumer interests, it has become common and even somewhat expected practice in the modern gaming industry to expect consumers to spend $60 on a game, only for within a few years after making said purchase to have that expensive game become no longer playable or accessible. From the AAA publisher's point of view, it seems that they want you to own nothing and be happy. Few seem to have raised much of an issue with this and instead continue to let the greedy publishers get away with this. It feels like they can easily distract people with a shiny new game, causing consumers to forget about their previous purchases, which they spent a lot of money on and should ethically still have access to indefinitely, whether they feel like playing these games or not. So, with that said, let's look at how so many of us have ended up in this horrendous scenario where we have become conditioned and brainwashed into believing this sort of thing is okay, but more importantly, how we can actually do something about this disgusting and, in my opinion, unacceptable corporate practice. This needs to end now. Sadly, most of us have been at points before where we have paid a small fortune for a game, really enjoyed it, put it back on the shelf for a few years and gone to play it again, only to discover that online support for the title has been removed entirely. Nintendo, for example, has a dreadful reputation when it comes to providing long-term support for their customers' purchases. But there are many instances where this situation becomes even worse when the entire gaming experience needs to be enjoyed online, a format style that is becoming increasingly more prevalent. Take, for example, The Crew, a title that managed to shift an eye-watering 12 million units. Can you imagine how much money that game made? That's 12 million people who have The Crew as a part of their game collection, or at least did. You see, despite it being extremely clear that Ubisoft made enough money off this title to sustain support for it for as long as their audience lives, this hasn't stopped them from dropping all support for the game simply due to not enough of their customers playing it anymore. Not only this, but to really rub salt in the wound, the game was so successful they even released a sequel to this game, which means that now if you want to have a The Crew experience, you'll have to pay for the newer game rather than being able to use the one you already paid for. I'm not sure what's worse, the fact that companies like Ubisoft see this as perfectly acceptable behaviour, or that gamers as a whole have allowed stuff like this to become normalised practices despite the ethical questions it raises in the first place. In an attempt to rise against the machine and combat this ongoing non-consumer friendly issue, YouTuber Ross W. Scott of the channel Accursed Farms has uploaded a video highlighting what a sinister and despicable problem this is in the industry. His spicy upload features a call to arms advising us how we can all fight back legitimately and attempt to stop these greedy, money-obsessed companies from stealing games from us that we have already paid for and thus should always have access to. Citing the Video Game History Foundation, he highlights that only 13% of video games created are commercially available, meaning a staggering 87% cannot be attained from the source anymore. But one of the biggest issues comes in when publishers stop supporting online multiplayer games. Through his own research, he believes that this figure is much worse than 13% and likely much closer to 3%. On the whole, he would discover that there are very few modern games released that do not defraud their customer base. Now, you might think that defraud is a strong term for this, but the way in which the big publishers sell us games lacks any kind of transparency whatsoever, and they would prefer that we didn't question things and let them keep it that way. For example, I think there's a difference between buying a game from a game store or hiring a title from Blockbuster. So when we've bought games, we've purchased them on the expectation that they are ours and we'll own them forever. Purchasing a game is not a rental agreement, and they're not advising us there is a finite amount of time we'll be able to play the game. It's very deceptive and intentionally so. The more we progress through time, the publishers take games away from consumers more and more, and the worrying thing is people are becoming increasingly numb to this. Scott, in his video, put it that, in his opinion, companies are purposely withholding information from us with regards to how long they want to support a game, believing if they told us the truth, it would hurt sales. What they're essentially doing is cashing in on confusion. By keeping us in the dark in such situations as much as possible, they avoid backlash and only withdraw support from the games when they feel interest has subsided. This seems easy to pull off, as when an audience becomes small for a title, there aren't going to be enough people around to leverage a protest. In Scott's own words, all of this is an assault on consumer rights, and that in any other industry, a company destroying what they have sold to you as a consumer would be illegal. So why are we letting them get away with it in the gaming industry? While we mostly ignore these goings-ons, occasionally these sorts of practices are so egregious and overt that we do revolt. Take the Xbox One unveiling, for example, an incident where a big tech company became so arrogant and so self-assured that people would buy their products no matter how they packaged them, that their hubris allowed them to publicly announce how they were going to tie us all up like kippers if we wanted one of their consoles. Offering little to no benefits to consumers and mostly hindrances, Microsoft seemed to think that gamers would be more than happy with their digital rights management and privacy practices, no matter how dystopian and disempowering they seemed to be. They wrongly assumed that throwing the word Xbox on the console's casing would be enough to bend consumers to their will. Fortunately, in this instance, in most cases, even the most fervent Xbox fanboy would be against what Microsoft wanted to implement. You'll probably remember that if you bought a game, it was going to be tied to your account, which meant you couldn't share your game with a friend or even sell it on after you didn't want it anymore. Even worse than this, though, was that Microsoft expected us consumers to make sure our Xbox was connected to the internet periodically, something like once every day, or our accounts would get locked. They wanted complete control over the media we were consuming. Further to this, they also insisted that the Kinect peripheral had to be attached for it to function. Like a Chinese surveillance state, but from the comfort of your living room. I mean, that's a massive privacy issue. Yeah, so everyone kicked off and Microsoft was forced at the time to cut back on all of this nonsense. But since then, it seems we are becoming increasingly desensitized to stuff like this. For example, Kinect would have easily been able to monitor what was going on in a room and collect biometric data. But how many of us just leave an Alexa plugged in, listening to us all the time? Or use our voices for Siri and Google voice activated commands? Perhaps then it could be retrospectively said that Microsoft wasn't actually wrong about what consumers would accept. They were just a little too early in the brainwashing phase to succeed at that point. The way you need to look at this example was that because enough people cared and talked about it, reported on it, were vehemently against and voted with their pockets, Microsoft was forced to course correct. However, when it comes to removing the ability to play games which customers have paid for historically and are no longer in the spotlight, little to no backlash occurs when they are removed. This is because such games are of very little interest to the average consumer anymore, but that doesn't make taking away access to them, which has been paid for, any less morally reprehensible. Put it this way, imagine owning a Super Nintendo collection, or maybe you do own a Super Nintendo collection, and shifty Shigeru Miyamoto sneaking into your home at night and slowly repossessing all the cartridges you've paid for. This is exactly the sort of practice that companies like Ubisoft not only regularly partake in a digital sense, but actively try to convince you is normal and to be expected. The greed and entitlement of these companies are vile, and the fact we are so accepting of this is frightening. To compound issues with Ubisoft further, when talking to GI.biz in the past, director of Ubisoft subscriptions Philippe Tremblay pushed in an interview that he believed Ubisoft should have even more control over gamers' media, stating, "One of the things we saw is that gamers are used to having and owning their games. They got comfortable not owning their CD collection or DVD collection. That's a transformation that's been a bit slower to happen in games. It's about feeling comfortable with not owning your game. I still have 2 boxes of DVDs. I definitely understand the game's perspective with that. But as people embrace that model, they will see that these games will exist, the service will continue, and you'll be able to access them when you feel like. That's reassuring." As demonstrated by what has happened with The Crew recently, even though Ubisoft are yet to become a digital-only publisher, at this point players already cannot access some of the media they have paid for from the big brand. So how does he expect gamers to commit to joining them in an all-digital future then? The thought seems totally ridiculous when we consider how little they seem to respect or value us. As you can see from his own words, he's literally lying directly to our faces that the games will always be accessible, even though they're already not.
You liar!
What an embarrassing and condescending, sleazy corporate slimeball. These people are worse than politicians. And lie to us more too. While Ubisoft is far from the only one guilty of partaking in these terrible practices, Ross from Accursed Farms has identified that The Crew functions as a great starting point to begin confronting these companies and attempting to take back control of our gaming libraries. With The Crew serving as a means to an end, Ross has set up a website that lays out the most appropriate information necessary that we can utilise to attempt to penalise big companies who are flagrantly killing our games. The website outlines that an increasing number of video games are sold as goods, but designed to be completely unplayable for everyone as soon as support ends. The legality of this practice is untested worldwide, and many governments do not have clear laws regarding these actions. So it is therefore StopKillingGames.com's goal to have authorities examine this behaviour and hopefully end it, as it is an assault on both consumer rights and the preservation of media. In order to attempt to achieve this, a 2-pronged attack is needed, with the first action being taken on The Crew, which raises the question, why The Crew of all games? Ross states that the game was recently destroyed for all players and had a player base of at least 12 million people. Due to the game's size and France's strong consumer protection laws, this represents one of the best opportunities to hold a publisher accountable for this action. If we are successful in charges being pressed against Ubisoft, this can have a ripple effect on the video games industry to prevent publishers from destroying more games. To tackle this issue on a second front, Ross outlines that government petitions will be involved. The website suggests that official government petitions have been introduced to prohibit the practice of intentionally rendering commercial video games inoperable when support ends. In Ross's video on the topic, he adds that government initiatives are important, as when the petitions reach certain thresholds in certain countries like the UK, it becomes the law to debate them in Parliament. He adds that if companies face penalties for destroying copies of games they have sold, this is very likely to start curbing this behaviour. If a company is forced to allow customers to retain their games in even one country, implementing those fixes worldwide becomes a trivial issue for them. So, if destroying a game you paid for became illegal in France, companies that patch the game would likely apply the same patch to the games worldwide. An analogy to this process is how the ACCC in Australia forced Valve to offer refunds on Steam, so Valve ended up offering them to people worldwide as a result. Nice. Despite this, some corporate shills would debate that games are never sold to customers but instead are merely licensed. But the website disagrees with this, outlining that this is a large legal grey area, depending on the country. In the United States, this is generally the case. In other countries, the law is not clear at all, since license agreements cannot override national laws. Those laws often consider video games as goods, which have many consumer protections that apply to them. So, despite what the license agreement may say, in some countries you are indeed sold your copy of the game license, even though some big tech lizards may try to tell you otherwise. With regards to online-only multiplayer games, the website also reminds readers that the majority of online multiplayer games in the past functioned without any company servers and were conducted by the customers privately hosting servers themselves and connecting to each other. Games that were designed this way are all still playable today. If a company has designed a game with no thought given towards the possibility of letting users run the game without their support, this can be a challenging goal to transition to. If a game has been designed with that as an eventual requirement, then this process can be trivial and relatively simple to implement. Another way to look at this is it could be problematic for some games of today, but there is no reason it needs to be for games of the future. Consolidating this campaign's goals in Ross's YouTube upload, he reiterates that the purpose of this is to try and ensure games remain playable after publisher support ends. Past this, they should remain functional with no further connection to a publisher to need to function, with this same logic also applying to microtransactions. Essentially, if you pay $2 for a skin, that should be your property forever. More importantly, licensing agreements should not supersede these rules, the very excuse that companies often use to scapegoat this behaviour. He also knows that part of the reason that Ubisoft is the most sensible to challenge to get the ball rolling in comparison to some of their American contemporaries is that Ubisoft is French. We had some fun last week on here laughing at some of the ignorance coming from IGN France, but one benefit the French do have over those who live in the US is considerably more consumer freedom due to having significantly more consumer rights. The United States and people from there often proudly, and rightly so in many instances, consider the country to be the land of the free. And while it is certainly true that freedom of speech stretches further in that country than others, greater freedoms in other areas of life are better experienced in Europe. France has a strong tradition of political activism and public expression dating back centuries. Factors such as a robust labour movement, a history of revolutionary ideals, and a culture of civic engagement contribute to the frequency of protests and demonstrations in the country. If you know your history, this sometimes even devolves into violence and ends up with people's heads getting chopped off. So France provides more than fertile soil for a gaming revolution to take place in. Perhaps due to this activism, French consumer laws are often perceived as much stronger than those in the United States, which seems to be why Ubisoft can be more easily challenged than the US corporations, who have a much tighter grip around consumers' necks, successfully stripping customers of their rights over the years. In Ross's great upload, he advises everyone to visit stopkillinggames.com to take the right action applicable to your country, but highlights that France is the most important place to fight due to the great consumer protections over there. These include the ability to summon legal government mediators who can take action on consumers' behalf, and the ability to contact the UFC Courtoisie, who have a good record defending gamer rights already. The website and Ross's original upload both do a great job of explaining the processes of fighting back better than I do, so make sure you visit them so you can consider taking action yourself. It's time that big game publishers stopped killing the games that we paid them for. Vive la France, vive la résistance. Anyway, if you enjoyed today's upload, subscribe and consider supporting me on Patreon. Adieu.